Hello, everyone. Today we are here again with another session on joint ventures. This podcast, our main focus is some of the joint venture success stories we are going to share with you. And I have a special guest today, Dhruv Mehra. Dhruv is a partner in Mercer. He is looking after US and Canada market. I like Dhruv. Welcome you to this podcast, and maybe if you can give short introduction about yourself to the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, Dharmendra. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking to everybody. So I've got over 20 years of experience in human capital advisory, and a majority of that has been spent in the mergers and acquisition space. Worked on deals across the transaction timeline, right from the strategy and readiness through due diligence, integration planning, and then post-merge integration. And I have also worked on deals across industries and across markets. I was based in the US for the first 10 years of my career. And then I was in Asia, based in Singapore. And finally now back in the US, in the Bay Area, looking at both private equity and corporate transactions in my new role. So happy to talk to you about this exciting topic of joint ventures today.
Right. So I remember we spoke a lot about, how to integrate two companies, what are the people challenges. And we thought, we should also look at alternative to M&A, that is called joint venture. So my first question is more from, I'm trying to understand for the, why company prefer joint venture to acquisition? What are the common motivation behind company entering into JV? So if you can give some idea about, joint venture versus acquisitions.
Yeah, I think it's a great question to kick us off, Dharmendra. And, especially relevant in today's market scenario where the cost of borrowing has skyrocketed, right? And nobody can tell when it's going to, start reducing. And we haven't seen valuations really come down that much. So more and more companies are beginning to explore alternative types of transactions and joint ventures. And maybe I just refer to them as JVs for efficiency going forward.
Yeah.
This can be an effective type of transaction in this scenario. But I think before I answer that question, let me first begin by explaining why JVs are different to mergers or acquisitions. So in a JV, you have two or more businesses that decide to combine their resources in order to complete a stated goal or a project. They can take different legal entity structures. It could be a corporation, it could be a partnership, it could be a limited liability company. And then they generally exist separate from the partner's existing businesses. And they're often also typically around for a very specified period of time. So once the JV's goals or outcomes are achieved, typically there is an exit by at least one or if not both partners. Now, this is different from an acquisition where one party takes control of another, and then sometimes either partially or fully integrates the target company's operations into its existing business. Even in a situation where the target is kept standalone, the buyer has full control of the acquired company, so they can make changes as they deem fit. So why does this JV structure then, present an advantage sometimes to mergers and acquisitions? I think the biggest advantage of a JV is the opportunity to leverage the combined resources of both companies without bearing all of the costs and risks, right? In an acquisition, you acquire all the capabilities, but it could be extremely costly and you bear the risk if that acquisition doesn't pan out. Mm-hmm. And in the JV, the JV can also maintain its own identity, and the two partners can then return to normal business operations once the JV is complete. So this can be a very effective strategy. It's also a great way for companies to enter high-risk foreign markets, right? I mean, let's look at some of the examples. Just over a decade ago, I remember Microsoft and GE had entered into a JV called Caradigm. It was aimed at using data to improve healthcare quality and patient experience. So basically, it brought together Microsoft's capabilities in large-scale data platforms and GE's experience in developing healthcare applications. So this is a good example of how JVs can be structured and where the two partners can complement each other. I think the second question you asked was, what were some of the common motivations behind companies entering into JVs, right? So in my experience, JVs have become fairly standard practice in certain industries like energy, oil and gas, or construction, or aerospace, defense. These are industries which require big, infrastructure projects and spend, right? So if the shared capabilities and financial resources can be lessened through a JV structure, it's quite advantageous in these industries. I have a number of clients in the oil and gas space, for instance, that commonly use JVs. One example of this is Saudi Aramco, which is Saudi Arabia's national oil company. A few years ago, they had entered into a couple of JVs with Petronas, which is Malaysia's national oil company. Now, these are two of the largest oil companies globally coming together. And they were essentially collaborating, in the refining and petrochem space. So Saudi Aramco was supplying the refinery's crude feedstock, whereas some of the natural gas, power, and other utilities were being supplied by Petronas. So again, a good example of this. In the aerospace and defense industry, another one that comes to mind is Lockheed Martin and Boeing. They came together to form ULA, which is the United Launch Alliance. It's actually, I think, one of the main competitors to Elon Musk's SpaceX. And then I'd mentioned that another reason for its popularity has been for especially multinationals to access certain markets in fast-growing economies, like India, China, Russia, Brazil. Walmart, for instance, had used this strategy effectively when they entered the India market. Or even if we look at the auto space, BMW entered the China market with a JV with Brilliance Auto Group. And it's because the Chinese laws required that manufacturing operations had to be at least 50% Chinese owned. So, very often, because of regulatory reasons, a company has to enter a new market through a JV, and they can't do it via acquisition. So these are some of the common motivations that I've seen in the past. Yeah.
So I think, some of the question we already answered with my next question. So if you look at in regular M&A, there is a value creation. We talk about one party acquiring another company and then looking at how to integrate and how to create more value. In the case of joint venture, what do the two parties bring? How the value is created? So this is more on, looking at perspective of the joint venture.
Yeah, I mean, this can really vary from one JV to another, right? However, I think the two parties typically bring some differentiated capability, that the other doesn't have. Like in the Caradigm example that I mentioned, Microsoft brought its large-scale data platforms, whereas GE had, experience in developing healthcare applications and appliances. I think in foreign market entries, what I've seen is like the multinational partners typically provide either the products or the tech or the operational experience, while often the local partners provide, say, an existing distribution channel or just deep local market knowledge. One that recently came about was Vistara, which is a joint venture between Singapore Airlines and the Tata Group, right, in the aviation space in India. Now, I was a frequent flyer in Singapore Airlines. It's often voted as one of the top airlines in the world. And I can tell you that they are really well known for its operational excellence, right? Whereas the Tata Group is one of India's largest conglomerates. They have a long history in the country and so deeply understand, I think, the way, the market works. And so I think, if either party had wanted to independently establish a new airline in India, it would have been a much harder, value prop for them. So sort of this is how I think the combination really created value.
So, some of the Maybe you can answer this better in the recent example you gave. So according to you, what are the strategic rationale behind establishing a joint venture as against a greenfield or a 100% owned entity? What do you think that what should be the basic strategic rationale behind that?
I think it comes down to those three things. It's cost, risk, and time to launch, right? A JV instead of a greenfield would help a company reduce costs, reduce risk, and can greatly accelerate the time to launch the new venture. So it can be a very attractive option. At the same time, I think it's worth mentioning that there are some downsides to the JV as well, right? So because I think the biggest challenge is the shared control. Because in an acquisition, the acquirer has 100% ownership typically, right? They can make all the decisions. Whereas in a JV, especially in 50-50 JVs, it can be quite tricky because the two parties independently have their own, boards to respond to and their own business operations. So there can be a misalignment of interests. And so that can actually pose as a significant risk to the JV. So I think it is a balance between the two.
Right. And I think culture also plays a bigger role because when, there are two party, 50% shares and, I think having a joint decision could be another challenge.
Absolutely.
Culture, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely.
So, just looking at most of the time I have seen that, most of the JV are like that, right? So what are some key controlling points in a JV? Any government issue, which could be a risk to a potential deal breaker when you are looking at JV?
That's a great question. I think some of the key components to include, in the JV and in the JV agreement, I think first and foremost, there has to be a very clear purpose and objective of the JV, right? There needs to be a clear board structure and, the board members and the advisors should all be listed. The management team and the key employees also should be front and center and articulated if known. If at the launch of the JV, the management team has not been appointed, at the very least, the roles should be very well defined, at least for the launch of the JV. And then the capital contributions of each party, these should include sort of the initial contribution percentages and the ongoing contributions. Also, any other resources or support that the parent companies are providing. And then the length of time which, these services and support will be provided. Besides that, I think the economic model is important. So the distribution of profits, losses, the balance sheet, who's going to contribute what, as well as the governance framework, the decision-making, delegation of authority, and very important point is mediation of disputes. We know that both parties are going to have, differing views and different cultures and different ways of working. So where, you get stuck and there's conflict, how is that going to be mediated and managed? And then another, I think, point which shouldn't be ignored is the exit strategy of the two partners, right? Because most JVs have sort of a stated objective, once the objective is met, how do you dissolve the JV? Is it going to be an independent listing? Is it going to be an acquisition by one of the JV partners? Is it going to be a sale to a third party? I think it's important to have some sense of what that exit strategy is upfront.
Right. Because many things, coming in between that drive the decision. Even, both JV partners could take the decision to exit very early. Even you have signed a long-term JV, but, some situation you have to come out from the JV. Or maybe you might go for acquisitions. So I've seen some of the JV which turned to be pretty good acquisition targets.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, my next question is, more on strategic alignment. So how critical is the strategic alignment between participating company in a JV?
I think Yeah, the strategic alignment between the two parties is extremely crucial in a JV, right? And it has to start, literally before the launch of the venture, right?
Right.
If you think of an acquisition, if an acquisition goes off course, the buyer has the power to take all the steps required to course correct and to shift direction. If you will, they have the keys to the car, right? But in a JV situation, if one party does not have a significant maturity, and sometimes even if they do, you kind of can't start over, right? So you really need the right foundation when the deal is signed, and you need a solid agreement both on the strategy and on the ways of working and culture, as well as on how eventually you're going to exit out of that deal upfront. So some of the questions that we often look out for and ask upfront, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these come top of mind. I think some of the things I mentioned. What are the key outcomes or expected outcomes of the JV? What is the operating model, right? That will be most effective to achieve the outcomes. And you have to really get into the nitty-gritties here. So for instance, what is your target market? How are you going to approach that target market? Are you going to be focusing on revenue growth or profitability, right? Again, different parties may have different views on what they want to achieve. And then what are the differentiated capabilities that each party is bringing to the table? It's very important to recognize that. I think you touched on culture. It's really critical to understand and articulate what kind of culture will enable, the JV to sort of meet its intended outcomes. Then how will this JV be governed? Who will lead the JV, for how long? How will talent be sourced for the JV? I think all of these points are very important to sort of go through and articulate upfront.
So that's why, doing a JV agreement is not easy. There are lots of points to be taken care of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, even when the parties are aligned on the above, right? We are living in such a rapidly changing world today.
Right.
I think the best companies anticipate that conditions are going to change, right? And so for a JV to be able to survive and adapt to those changes, they've got to establish very frequent performance tracking meetings, whether it's quarterly or sometimes even monthly, and then probably bigger strategic reviews of the JV by the board every 2 to 3 years to ensure that the JV still remains on track to achieve the outcomes of the venture. So, that I think is an area that sometimes companies falter on. There's a huge effort up front to make sure that the outcomes are, listed out. But as you go along the process and as the world around you changes, like right now, interest rates are way higher than anybody anticipated a few years ago. You've got to rethink, and reposition the strategic outcomes of the JV.
Exactly. So if you can give some of the recent JV success story that in particular stands out to you, and you say that, okay, this is the recent one, and how you think that it could be unique and remarkable one.
Yeah, sure. So a few years ago, I had worked on a JV with a client in the high-tech space, and they had entered into a JV agreement with a robotics manufacturer. It was a 50-50 JV, and the client that I was working with, they were providing sort of the software and program management, while the other partner was providing the manufacturing capabilities in the JV. So in my view, this JV has been successful, though I must confess it's still early days. But I think there were 4 or 5 things that I can think of that they did well, right? So number one, I think we've referred to this before, is strategic alignment at the top. That was addressed front and center between both organizations, both on the strategy and the operating model. So the JV partners really took the time to have the difficult conversations and align on things like the target market, the product and service mix that they were going for, the financial performance expectations, and in this case, they decided that the focus was really going to be on revenue growth in the first 3 years versus profitability. So they also had to make sure that there was enough funding into this JV, until the JV could achieve profitability.
Okay.
The second thing that they did was they agreed on a governance model and a decision matrix, which included how they were going to address the conflict resolution.
Okay.
The third area was the economic model, which again went into a fair amount of detail, including financial capital, human skills, material resources, and any other functional support like sales, marketing, human resources, what would be provided by each company, and until when it would be provided, basically until the JV could operate independently. So there were some timelines put there. I think the fourth thing, the partners were culturally quite different, but they again very proactively decided and developed a culture blueprint for the new JV from the ground up. So they decided that the JV should have its own identity and its own operating environment that would position the JV to achieve, the future desired outcomes. So again, they were very thoughtful about let's not try and burden this new JV with, the legacy cultures and and separate from that. And then finally, I would say they also built out a very detailed workforce plan, which included, the employees that would be seconded from the JV to the JV from the parents and for how long, and then which roles they would externally recruit for. So this was all sort of laid out, very early on in the JV plan, before they launched.
Yeah, I think you covered most of the things here. You're taking care of culture, looking at various strategic, like the example what you gave looks like, both parties have very solid strategic intent, basic due diligence was done, and then they structure the whole JV carefully, looking at short-term, medium, and long-term growth. Right? Yeah. So, now we have another question which is coming more directly from, the integration part. So, seamless integration of operation is always a, key to successful JV. If you can share some of the examples where company navigated operational challenge successfully.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in the work that we do, we get fairly deeply involved in some of the workforce and rewards aspects, right? Of JVs. So I had worked on a JV with, between two partners. In this JV, it was actually a multi-country JV, and it included small headcounts across multiple jurisdictions. And it was decided that, at least initially in the JV, employees would be seconded from the parent at launch. And the HR work stream was tasked with developing the entire rewards philosophy and setting up all of the compensation and benefit programs for the JV. So there were multiple challenges, like operational challenges that we had to navigate. Number one was that at least both the parent companies had very different reward philosophies, and it was going to be challenging to harmonize the comp and benefit programs, just looking at where the two parent organizations were. The headcounts were also quite small, so it would be difficult to stand up the new group programs at the start of the venture, right? In some countries, there were just 3 or 4 employees that were, in the launch. And then from an employee experience standpoint, it's never an attractive option where, like, if you're seconding an employee from the parent company to the JV, if you move them temporarily into new comp and ben programs and then move them back, right, into what they were receiving, it poses all kinds of challenges like break of service, etc. So that wasn't going to be ideal. So we navigated these challenges by doing a few things. So number one is we kept the existing employees that were being seconded. We kept them on the respective parent company's payroll and benefits, right? And just transfer the cost to the JV for the secondment period. At the same time, rather than looking at trying to harmonize what the existing parent companies were getting, we basically created a new rewards philosophy and new rewards programs from the ground up, purely based on external market benchmarking, keeping in mind sort of the peer group that this JV was going to really be competing against, right? And keeping in mind, that culture blueprint of this JV. So these programs sort of were designed, and then they would be implemented only once a critical employee threshold was met in each country, right? So we could put in place some efficient, cost-efficient, programs. Right. So there were many such challenges to navigate, but this is one that comes to mind where, you really have to go into the details, because it is not as easy to navigate, even compared to sometimes other acquisitions. Yeah.
Right. And especially when, there are several countries where people are involved, maybe a smaller size to larger employee. Having such JV have other challenges as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So thanks for your time. And I think this was a very interactive session. Thanks for the listeners who have been listening to this. The idea of, this podcast was mainly to make sure that we also talk about JV and what challenges we have and what are some of the best practices Dhruv have mentioned. I think we'll be able to apply. Thanks again for listening. Thank you, Dhruv.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dharmendra.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you.